Hello and welcome to my channel. The subject of this video is a critical review of an article entitled When the Gods Drank Urine by Mike Crowley. I have recently been working on an upcoming study on the subject of the Soma in the Vedas by going through my notebooks, other notes, and the text of the Vedas. Hoping to be helpful, a friend sent me an article entitled When the Gods Drank Urine by Mike Crowley. Perhaps it is a function of the fact that Mars was combust behind the sun in Gemini, and this was all aspecting a full moon in Sagittarius. But when I read this, I found myself greatly annoyed with the article and was driven to write down the information for this video. Since I do not possess the Pashupatastra, it was the only way that I could vent my anger. So you could view this as a bit of therapy, as well as an introduction to the upcoming article on the Soma. I'm not sure when that will be done. I have something else that I'm working on at the same time. But within a month, I expect to have it. The subject of Mr. Crowley's article is the Vedic Soma and his assertion that this is the Amanita muscaria mushroom. In itself, this is not uncommon and has been an established opinion in some quarters since the 1950s. What struck me most about the article is that there are no direct quotes or direct references from any of the Vedas in this article. There are isolated words such as tawny and highly questionable sentences which are claimed to be from somewhere in the Vedas, but they are all drawn from secondary sources. No mandala, hymn, or verse number is anywhere given. What might we suspect from such a clue? Additionally, this lack of Vedic knowledge becomes painfully clear when he writes, quote, "Despite its extensive hymns of praise to the drug, all the 114 verses of the 9th chapter and several verses elsewhere, the Rig Veda alludes to it only obliquely," unquote. In fact, it is not the 9th chapter of which the mantras are dedicated to Soma. It is the whole 9th mandala, which is composed of 110 complete hymns, not verses. It is a large section of the Rig Veda. As we shall see, against the claims of Mr. Crowley, there is a wealth of material in the Vedas about the Soma. It is impossible to accurately study the subject of the Vedic Soma outside the original sources. This is really very basic. This denies any foundations to the claims asserted in this article. Definition of the Soma. For those who may not be familiar with the subject, the Soma is a plant that was used in rituals by the Vedic priest. It is estimated that perhaps around the 5th century BC, this practice changed and the exact knowledge of the plant was gradually lost. Given its central importance, Soma is frequently spoken of in all 4 of the Holy Vedas. However, if one reads all statements with the term Soma in them as having the same subject, then it will only lead to confusion. In the Vedas, it is the norm for a single word to be used with several meanings, distinct but interrelated, which are defined by context. This is what I have called elsewhere triplification. Soma could be read in three ways, and perhaps even four, actually. There are times when Soma refers to the moon, such as, quote, Soma causes plants to grow, unquote, quote, abides in the waters of the firmament, unquote, and dwells amid the lunar asterisms, or nakshatras, as they are called in Vedic astrology. Soma is also a physical plant used in ritual. There has been something of a debate about this subject, and Mr. Crowley is right on that point. His outline of the ritual sacrifice of the Soma is in many points close enough, and I will not dispute that here, since I'm only concerned with certain main points in the article, and I will touch on that later. Another separate use of the word is for the Yogic Soma. This is an interesting phenomenon. It is completely internal. In the Atharva Veda, the sages tell us explicitly, quote, one who thinks he has drunk the Soma with the herb is mistaken, unquote. That is because the Soma is drunk, quote, in one's heart, unquote. Because, again, quote, this Soma dwells in our hearts, unquote. We are told this Soma is, quote, the ultimate of all things, quote, which generated, quote, Vishnu, Agni, and Indra, and all beings, unquote. In other words, the yogic Soma is consciousness. Mr. Crowley tells us that, quote, for some reason, Soma became merely a philosophical concept rather than a living reality, unquote. After Soma ceased to be used, as if this transition were an afterthought or a consolation prize, perhaps, for the loss of the plant in the ritual. This is completely wrong, as we can see from the mantras that I just cited. He further misreads this by confusing the yogic Soma with the physical plant when he says, quote, the celestial drink which conferred immortality upon the gods, and by means of which mere mortals become gods, end quote. This is also wrong. A brew of crushed plant and boiled milk, which is the drink, will not grant immortality any more than a hot toddy of Roman and warm milk will before bed. This is the path of the yogic Soma to the Devas. It has nothing to do with the plant. Mr. Crowley's erroneous focus on second-hand broken verses and the Tibetan Buddhist sources led him to a mushroom. If he had gazed into the light of the Vedas directly, it would have taken him to consciousness. These are definitely two different ends. There are times when the Soma will appear as a Deva, but this is ambiguous and is beyond this study. Origin of the Soma. Lacking sources in the Vedas has led Mr. Crowley to make further erroneous statements. We will begin with the origins of the Soma. He ties the Vedic Soma to the legend of the churning of the ocean of the milk. In this legend, the Devas and Asuras churned the primeval ocean, and among other things, the Amrita, the elixir of life, emerges. Since the words Amrita and Soma are at times used interchangeably in the Vedas, he sees this as the origin of the Vedic Soma. It is true that such an equivalency of the words is occasionally present in the primary Vedic text. This is false in that this is not the origin of the Soma in the Vedas. This legend is from the Puranas. It is not in the Vedas at all. According to the professors, who are often wrong about these things, the dates of the Puranas are from 250 to 1000 AD. This is, even by his own incorrect late dates for the Vedas and the allusion to the historical fiction of the Aryan invasion, some 2,000 or more years removed from the Vedas. By the time of this tale, Soma was long past use in Hindu rituals. It bears no relation to the subject from the practice of textual analysis. Further, there is an overabundance of information about the Soma in all aspects in the Vedas. There is no need to resort to sources which are later in an attempt to uncover a lost tradition, which would be, by the way, a highly speculative endeavor. There is no need for such an activity in this case. In the Vedas, the origin of the Soma is that it is brought by a hawk. If one searches the imagery of Soma as a Deva, it will be found that the hawk is seen to be the Deva's mount. This is the reason. The Soma is associated with other animals, such as the red bull, but the carrier of the Soma originally was the hawk, and there are esoteric reasons for this. The Soma plant. If we wish to understand which plant the Vedic seers were using in their rituals, we need to examine consistently two factors in the text: description and effects. There is an abundance of material for both. In fact, too much for this current study. And the interested viewer is asked to be patient until I put together something which will be much larger. I will also have a unique revelation about the use of the Soma. Description. Beginning with the Rig Veda, we know clearly that the Soma grows in the mountains and is more abundant in the rainy seasons. To be fair and consistent, there is one mantra which could be read that the Soma grows in forest. This is important because the mushroom would be more abundant in forested areas. Here the Soma is called the sovereign of the forest, but this is probably stretching the context in the Yajur Veda. Mostly, it is clearly described as a mountain plant. This is repeated in the Sama Veda. Interestingly, the Soma plant is there called a creeper. The Soma plant itself is described as yellow and brown in different places. In the above quote from the Sama Veda, the Soma is also called golden-hued. The Soma liquid, when crushed for ritual, is green and becomes white once mixed with milk, and is tawny when honey is added. In the Yajur and the Atharva Vedas are further details about this plant. It is a stalk and is yellow. The Yajur Veda also explicitly says that the Soma is a sprig. Now, a sprig means that there is a flowering part of the plant which has leaves. So this immediately means that it is not a mushroom. Effects. The effects of drinking the Soma brew are dramatic. All the Vedas are explicit on this point. It could be summed up in one word: exhilaration. It is a foe-destroying exhilaration which sustains our energy. This is why the Soma is called the Red Bull, and I find it very interesting that this image is used for an energy drink. In the Sama Veda, we are told it is a food that gives 1,000 powers, and that it gives an individual heroic strength. The Yajur Veda mentions the wild rapture of the juice. There is another effect of the brew which is implied, possibly because there was no word to express this. In the Yajur Veda, there is a ritual to counter the effects of excessive Soma drinking. What does this mean? If there were not a problem, such a ritual would not exist. Here, hence, there was an issue. It seems that the Soma brew was addictive. Mr. Crowley's statements on the Soma as the Amanita mushroom. He draws his arguments primarily from the writing of Wasun on this matter. He argues that the Soma is the mushroom because it was called tawny, although he does so again without citing any sources. We have seen above that in the Vedic text, this description is used for the mixed Soma liquid with honey and not for the plant itself. The plant is consistently described as either yellow or brown. Neither description can be applied to the Amanita mushroom, which is red with white dots, just like Santa Claus. He further quotes Wasun and tells us that it is not described as having leaves or flowers. Well, we have seen that this is in fact completely inaccurate because it is called a sprig in the Yajur Veda. Regardless, the part used by the seers in the ritual was the stalks, so even if the description of a sprig had not existed, the fact that no leaves or flowers are mentioned does not really mean anything, because they didn't use those parts. Further, the effects of the Amanita are psychedelic, and they are not addictive. So far as the effects, Mr. Crowley is curiously very careful to hedge his words in this. He calls Soma, quote, psychoactive, unquote, and provides a list of mental effects that literally cover the waterfront. It could do anything. However, the hallucinogenic effects of the mushroom are mentioned, and since he thinks that this is the Soma, clearly this is what he primarily expects. But he would be disappointed since there is no such description as an effect of the Soma brew in the Vedas. Further, that it is addictive means it cannot be the mushroom. The only plant which matches the appearance and effects is ephedra. I would point out, ephedra was banned in the United States as a stimulant used for dieting because it is addictive. Urine. Mr. Crowley in several places states that there was a practice of drinking urine in the Vedas and that this was associated with the Soma sacrifice. This is quite frankly bizarre. I have gazed through my notes and I have thought about this matter, and I cannot think of any mantra that could be reasonably read in this manner. I would assume otherwise that this is just some psychological projection on his part, but it is essential for him to support his theory that the Soma is a mushroom. For this mushroom to produce its hallucinogenic effects, it must be passed through the digestive system, as we all know from listening to Terence McKenna, who was also, by the way, wrong in this matter. This is why the Siberian shaman drink their urine, or the urine of the reindeer, again, interestingly, Santa Claus reference, who specifically like to eat it. Is this in the Vedas? Very basically, regarding the process of the Soma sacrifice. The Soma plant was crushed, mixed with water, and pressed by hand, then filtered through wool to remove any pieces of the plant stalk. And then the bliss-bestowing stream was poured into a vat or pitchers. This was mixed with milk, sometimes buttermilk, or curds, and, as we have seen, honey. Sometimes this was cooked. This was not done on the site of the fire ritual in the Hall of Sacrifice. The Soma was brought there in a wagon with a specific ceremony. This liquid was then poured into the sacred fire to the Devas and sprinkled over the grass upon the black antelope skin on the east side of the main of 7 altars. There is no verse that can be read in the Vedas that the seers drank their urine to gain hallucinogenic effects. All aspects of the Soma sacrifice are alluded to in the verses of the Vedas, needless to say the Brahmanas, as we have seen from my outline, to which even more detail could be added with ease. If urine drinking were there, it would be mentioned. Further, the seers had no need of taking hallucinogens to be able to see the Devas at that time. Tibetan Buddhist sources and the Holy Vedas. By far, the largest part of his article is devoted to Tibetan Buddhist sources. It would seem that he is more familiar with this area of study and devotion. In fact, he draws his final conclusions exclusively from Tibetan legends, specifically the legend of Chakdor, forgive my pronunciation. He says, quote, "The importance of the Buddhist version of this legend is that it provides the sought-for link between the Soma, in the case of Dusti use, and urine drinking, thus lending weight to the contention that the Soma plant was the Amanita muscaria mushroom," unquote. This and other Tibetan sources are key to his case. They are also key to showing the absolute absurdity of his methodology. To fully communicate this, we need to look at a parallel example. Let us suppose that we are told that the real way to understand the Iliad was to read it through the eyes of the Church Fathers. Hector is really the devil, and he is overcome in a struggle with Achilles, who is a figure of the Christ. To anyone with a basic education, this type of interpretation is ridiculous. But it does not convey the full brunt of what Mr. Crowley is doing and claiming. The reason for this is, many of the Church Fathers were Greek themselves. They spoke the same language as that used in Homer, although the simpler coinoform, and he was the basis for their education. There are too many connections. We need a wider gap. More accurately, we would have to read the Iliad as an Islamic religious text. This takes us across the river Styx to the realm of literary lunacy. How could I possibly compare reading the Iliad as an Islamic text with reading the Vedas from the vantage point of Tibetan Buddhism? Many would assume that since they are in the same area and Buddhism has roots in Hinduism, that this is an intellectually sustainable practice. This seems to be what Mr. Crowley believes, since he is using these materials in this manner. Tibetan Buddhism is the product of a completely different civilization. It is also a phenomenon of the Middle Ages, thus thousands of years away from the Vedas, which are, accepting the incorrect late academic dates, from the Bronze and Iron Ages. Not only does it take the legends of the Puranas, which we have seen are already far removed in time, intellectual content, and language from the Vedas, but it removes them even further from their original sources by expropriating the legends, rewriting them, changing them, and editing them to conform to their own hybrid religion, which is received secondhand from India. This is a religion which has no connection to the Vedic tradition. What they have done is no different than the crackpot idea of transforming Homer to recreate Achilles as Muhammad, then telling us that that is what it really meant all along. And reading anything in this abused manner and these stolen legends with value is absurd. To further support this, the Tibetan culture and people are as alien to the 5 tribes of the Aryan Confederacy that created the Vedas as the Arabs were to the classical Greeks. That both were present in the Mediterranean basin is about as relevant as the fact that the Tibetans were somewhere on the subcontinent with the authors of the Vedas. There is no need to examine whatever he constructs from these materials, since it is all inherently irrelevant to the subject. Mr. Crowley may be, in himself, a sincere person who is trying to grapple with this obscure topic. I commend that effort. But whatever his published credits, this article is indefensible, weak, and it contributes to making the subject of the Soma more confused, not clearer. Thank you for your time.